YouTube. And without further ado, I'd like to pass you over.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Always nice to be the guest speaker here. It's always been fun. And thank you also to Keith. I was going to say it's nice to have a connection, a Bournemouth connection there as well. So wish you I want to start with just well, okay. There's a couple, and they move into a new house. And as they're sitting in their kitchen, they're feeling very good about their new house, and they can see into the neighbour's garden, and they see that the woman from next door, she goes into the garden and she hangs up her laundry. She's hanging up her laundry in the garden, and the woman who's sitting in the kitchen of the couple in the new house starts to become quite angry. She says, "Look at the laundry; it's dirty. She's hanging it up. It's supposed to be clean, but it's dirty. Someone should tell her. You know, she's not using the soap right. She's not doing it right. Someone should tell her that it's dirty." And yeah, they just let it go. And this happens week after week, every time, every day. They're sitting in their kitchen, they see the woman, she puts out the laundry, the other woman gets a bit angry. Oh, it's dirty, someone needs to tell her. And eventually, one week, they're sitting there, and the woman comes out, she puts the laundry up, and the other woman who's sitting in the kitchen says, "Oh, it's clean. Obviously, she's figured out a new soap, or someone's told her what to do. She's changed a little bit. That's really good." And the husband, sort of sheepishly says, "Actually, the truth is, I've just cleaned the windows for the first time." And that's a lesson, a message in the notion of perspective. The perspective, of course, from inside the room where the windows are dirty changes everything. And it's very interesting because we find ourselves at the moment embedded in between two stories in which perspective is very important. In last week's Cedra, we have this fascinating and quite humorous and ironic story of Bilam and his donkey. You have Bilam, who's the sort of blinded seer. He's a seer. He's supposed to be able to see beyond the here and now, see the supernatural, and yet he can't see an angel who's right in front of his face. Whereas his donkey, the lowly donkey, can see what's going on. And in that moment, in the here and now, we see sort of Bilam's frustration that he thinks his donkey's misbehaving. He thinks his donkey's not acting correctly. He thinks he's being let down by the donkey, and it's quite frustrating and it induces anger in him. But actually, from the wider camera angle lens, if we see the whole story, the donkey is actually acting to save his life. And there's a really powerful lesson in perspective that after that, Hashem opens Bilam's eyes. And from that point onwards, he is called the man with the open eye because Hashem sort of lets him see the perspective. And then we come to this week's Sedra, or really the end of last week's Sedra, where we have another incident, which I think perspective is very important. Because if we were to take a snapshot, if we were to take just one scene out of this episode without understanding the context, when I was speaking with the youth, we often used to talk about trying to envisage the each parsha of the Torah as a TV series, and each parsha is a different episode, and they rather cleverly named that concept Coronation Street, which I thought was quite clever. It's quite good. So we always used to kind of talk about it. Imagine if in a TV scene where you just see Pinchas go in and he sees this couple being intimate, and he takes a spear and he stabs them both through the stomach. And if you just saw that moment, hopefully your impression of Pinchas would not be very positive, right? I wouldn't say very good things about you if you thought, yeah, that's a normal way to behave. That if we just saw that moment and take out the context from it, it seems to be quite negative. And yet we know that Pinchas was praised and he was rewarded, and ultimately it was seen as quite a praiseworthy act. And I want to talk about the fact that he was rewarded by becoming a Kohen. He entered the sort of kahuna, he entered the pact of being a Kohen, and he was the only ever person to be rewarded in such a way. Of course, the context being that although it's all right, no worries. Although Pinchas was the grandson of Aharon, it was only those named, only Aharon and his actual sons, and those born after that point who became the Kohanim. So Pinchas would have been missed out, he would have been skipped over. And yet, from this act, he was rewarded by becoming a Kohen. It reminds me of the very old classic joke of the man who goes up to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I want to become a Kohen." And the rabbi says, "Oh, there's nothing I can do." He says, "I'll give you $50,000 to the shul, nothing I can do. $100,000, I'm sorry, it's not how it works. $1,000,000. The rabbi says, "Well, why do you want to be a Kohen?" He says, "My father was a Kohen and his father was a Kohen. right? So it's funny because it's quite relevant to Korach because to Pinchas because his father was a Cohen and his father's father was a Cohen, but he wasn't. But after this act, he became rewarded. He was the only person to make that transition after Aaron and his sons, who wasn't born as a Cohen, but was rewarded as such. And leaving aside the propriety and the moral judgment of Pinchas's act, which is a fascinating topic and one originally I thought we were going to talk about that today, and then I pictured the look on Stephen's face as we entered the fourth or fifth hour of this conversation and thought better of it. But leaving that aside, that moral sort of judgment, the rewards aspect is particularly fascinating. Aharon, we think about Aharon as the original Kohen. Aharon's preeminence and predominant characteristic was that he was someone who was Ohev v'rodef shalom. He was someone who loved and pursued peace. And this character trait, this characteristic, is something that has become the core principle of Kohanim. It's one of the reasons why the Kohanim were dispersed. They weren't given their own portion of land in Israel, but rather they were dispersed across the land amongst the people so it would harbor and foster this feeling of love and brotherhood. It's also one of the reasons why the Kohanim and the Leviim relied on tithes, relied on Meiser, relied on Trima for their sustenance in order that it would encourage this feeling of brotherhood, this feeling of love, this feeling of peace and unity amongst the people. In fact, it's fascinating to note that the bracha at the beginning of Birkat Kohanim concludes with the words "Ba'ahava," with love. When the Kohanim redirect the brachot of Hashem to the Jewish people, they have to do it with love. It's actually part of halacha that you have to, when you stand up and when you duchen, when you do Birkat Kohanim, you have to do it with love. And there's interesting halachical ramifications for this, that if there's someone in the community, if there's a Kohen who has, as kids would say, beef or quarrel or sort of an active disagreement with a member of the community, and it hasn't been resolved, it hasn't been sorted, and there's still tension there. There's a question, there's an idea that they shouldn't duchen because they can't say with all seriousness, with all in a genuine frame of mind, ahava. They're not doing it genuinely with love for the entire community, and that's one of the main reasons that I try to avoid topics such as politics or football because I don't want to argue or quarrel with anyone and lose my duchening license. And therefore, this sort of idea of peace and brotherhood and love being at the core principle of the Kohanim is incredibly important. It's an incredibly crucial part of what it means to be a Kohen. And with this in mind, I just want to return to our original question. It seems paradoxical that the reward that Pinchas was given for a violent act against a fellow Jew should be that he's rewarded with the priesthood, which, as we said, is predicated on Aharon's love for all. It seems paradoxical. How can a violent act going and striking down a fellow Jew, however warranted that act may have been, how can the reward for that be for him to become the Kohen, for him to join the kahuna, for him to join the priesthood, which, as we said, the fundamental tenet of which is a love and care for the Jewish people around and a desire to foster peace. And I think in order to understand this, we need to delve a little bit deeper into understanding Aharon, and more specifically, understanding his shortcomings, which prevented him from entering the land of Israel. As we saw his death in the parsha we read last week in Parshat Chokat, we saw Aaron passed away. And it's fascinating that Abarbanel says, talking about the sins that happened when Moshe and Aaron struck the rock, he says Moshe and Aaron were not punished for what they did at this point, but rather their offenses lay in the distant past. Aaron sinned by making the golden calf, and Moshe sinned in sending the spies. Those were the reasons they were not privileged to enter the land, to defend their honor. However, their sins are not made explicit in the biblical text, and their actions are seen not as the sort of fundamental cause, but kind of as the straw that broke the camel's back. And perhaps we can build from this to understand that the real reason why the seemingly sort of minor issue of striking the rock led to such a harsh and profound punishment is due to the fact that it reflected and it highlighted failures that had been present in their past. It's also just interesting, before we get into that, to note that commentators such as the Ibn Ezra argue that the real sin that they did, they say the real sin that Moshe and Aaron committed lay in the fact that when the Jewish people went up to them and they complained and they said there's no water and we should have been part of the rebellions that died earlier and we should have gone back to Egypt, and they used their sort of classical complaining techniques. When that happened, The Torah explains how Moshe and Aaron fled from the congregation and fell on their faces. And Ibn Ezra says, amongst others, that that was the sin. That rather than standing steadfast in their beliefs and standing with confidence that Hashem would answer their prayers, instead they literally ran away, the Torah tells us. They fled and they fell on their faces before Hashem. And that was the sort of main sin that they did. And I think if we concentrate on that and we concentrate on Aharon, if there's one weakness in Aharon as an individual and as a leader, perhaps it is his inability to stand up to mob rule. In the instance of the golden calf, which we mentioned before, Aaron had given in to the will of the mob. Rather than stand up to them and tell them this is wrong and try and stop them and prevent them, instead, he tried to delay them, he tried to pacify them, he tried to slow things down, but he didn't stand up and say, we're not doing this, this is wrong. He didn't have that within him. And then in the incident of the waters, in the incident of striking the rock, rather than stand up to the mob and say, why are you complaining? Has Hashem not provided for you all these years? He'll provide for you again. Instead, he fled and he fell on his face before them. Now, before we get back to Pinchas, just to take a look at the fascinating verse that precedes Pinchas's violent act, it says, just then, a certain Israelite man came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions in the sight of Moshe and of the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So it's important that when we think about the sin of, as we know in this week's central, their names, Zimri and Cosby, it's important that we understand the context and what's going on in that sin. It's not just a case of a Jewish man, a leader of the Jewish people anyway, taking a Midianite woman and being immoral with her. That's not only what's going on. It's actually much broader than that. Zimri takes Cosby, he takes this woman, and he takes her in front of the entire Jewish people. He takes it in front of the leaders, and this whole act is an act of protest. This whole act is an act of trying to undermine and destroy the social bonds which are at the foundation of the Jewish society. This whole act isn't just something he's done because he's sort of burnt by lust. There's something much deeper going on than that, which is why he shows sort of Moshe, he goes in front of the leaders and says, look what I'm about to do. And it's very interesting. What's the reaction of Moshe and the other leaders? Torah tells us they sat and they cried opposite the Ohel Moed. They sat and they cried opposite the tent of meeting. Why is that? What a sort of weak reaction. Why are they sitting there and crying? Why aren't they doing something? And I think the answer lies in the fact, as we just said, this was a protest against Hashem, but it was also against them. It was against the leaders. It was against the structures that formed and underpinned the Jewish society. That's why it was done in front of them. So their intervention wouldn't have helped. It wouldn't have stopped the mob from acting the way they did. It wouldn't have changed anything because it would have just been seen as them clinging on to the structure that suited them. So what happens? We'll read it from inside. When Pinchas, son of Elazar, son of Aaron, the priest, saw what was happening, saw the sin that was taking place, he stood up from within the assembly and taking a spear in his hand, he followed the Israelite man into the chamber and stabbed them, both of them, the Israelite man and the woman, through the belly. And then the plague that Hashem had sent against the Israelites was checked, it was stopped. Pinchas is part of the crowd. Pinchas is in a way part of the mob, but he stands up and he goes to take action. In this case, as we said, it couldn't be the leaders. It had to be someone from within the people standing up and taking action. And Pinchas could have been torn to pieces by Zimri's supporters. It was an immense act of courage that he was willing, despite the fact that there was a whole mob, there was a whole group of people who were supporting this action. Nevertheless, he stood up and he went and did this, knowing what the ramifications could be. In other words, Pinchas was able to succeed where his grandfather Aaron failed, at standing up to the mob no matter the consequence. He was able to right the wrongs of the previous generation, and thus by becoming a Kohen, he completed the cycle and corrected the mistakes of the past. And I think it teaches us something immensely important about priesthood. The first and ultimate prerequisite is love and care for your fellows. That's the fundamental principle. But this must be coupled with an unflinching and unapologetic commitment to our values. We cannot step aside simply to mollify the mob or change our beliefs because they do not align to mainline public opinion. And this is pertinent because, as we've said, for those who this comes to the Parsha, we say this many times. The idea is that the Kohanim are a microcosm of the Jewish people. The role of the Kohanim amongst the nation reflects the nation's role in the world. And so too, we must carry this message that we have great love and care for all people, but that nevertheless, we must stick to our Torah values come what may. So, of course, taking this lesson on, we're not recommending that anyone does anything as drastic or as violent as Pinchas. Quite the opposite. That was for a specific time and place, and any such act of violence would be prohibited under pretty much any other context. But rather that we learn from him the strength to stand up from the crowd and be unafraid to do the right thing no matter what, even and especially when it flies in the face of sort of mob rule and public opinion that would be incorrect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Avi. That's very interesting. Does anyone have any comments or say anything on that, or should we move on? Okay. I'll say goodbye to the people on Zoom. We'll see you all next week. And I'll finish